Imagine driving a car, not just any car. Imagine a car born not in the sprawling factories of Detroit or the pristine workshops of Germany, but forged in the heart of a nation fighting to define its own future. A car designed for the thin air of high-altitude cities, for winding mountain roads, for a market the global giants saw as an afterthought. For decades, the world was told a simple story about the automotive industry. The story was that innovation, power, and design flowed from a few select countries: the United States, Germany, Japan. Everyone else was a customer, a market to be sold to, a place to build assembly plants, but never a place for true creation. This story was a lie, because in the middle of the 20th century, something extraordinary was happening south of the Rio Grande. A small, determined company dared to challenge the giants. It wasn't Ford. It wasn't General Motors. It wasn't Chrysler. It was a company called Vehículos Automotores Mexicanos, VAM. They didn't just assemble cars. They re-engineered them. They improved them. They created unique machines that were in many ways superior to their American parents. This is the story of how a group of Mexican engineers took American muscle and gave it a new heart, a new soul, and a new name. This is the story of a national dream cast in steel and chrome. A dream the world has almost forgotten. To understand the miracle of VAM, you must first understand the world it was born into. The year is 1946. The world is emerging from the shadow of global war. Mexico, like many developing nations, is filled with a new sense of purpose, a fervent desire for self-sufficiency. The era of simply exporting raw materials and importing finished goods had to end. The nation's leaders dreamed of an industrialized Mexico, a country that could build its own future with its own hands, its own factories, its own engineers. The automotive industry was the ultimate symbol of this dream, but it was a fortress, dominated by the colossal corporations of Detroit. The Big Three, General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler, were titans. Their resources were practically infinite. Their brands were globally recognized. In Mexico, they operated with an air of detached superiority. They would ship down knockdown kits, basically cars in a box, to be bolted together by local labor. The cars they sold were often ill-suited for the country. American engines, designed for the dense air at sea level, struggled and gasped in the high altitude of Mexico City, which sits at over 7,300 feet. They were inefficient, underpowered. The suspensions, built for smooth American highways, crumbled on Mexico's more rugged rural roads. But it didn't matter. There was no alternative. The giants of Detroit saw Mexico not as a unique engineering challenge, but as a captive, secondary market, a place to sell yesterday's technology at tomorrow's prices. The Mexican government saw this dependency for what it was: an economic vulnerability, a symbol of neo-colonialism. And so, in 1962, they made a move that would change everything. A presidential decree was issued. It was a declaration of industrial independence. By 1964, any automobile sold in Mexico had to have at least 60% of its parts manufactured domestically. No more kits, no more simple assembly. This was a direct challenge to the Big Three. For them, it was a costly annoyance, a bureaucratic hurdle. They would comply reluctantly by setting up engine plants and sourcing basic components locally. But their core philosophy remained unchanged. The real engineering, the real design, would always happen in Detroit. But for one small company, this decree was not a burden. It was an opportunity. It was the moment their mission became clear. The company's story began humbly. In 1946, it was founded as Willys Mexicana, a small operation assembling rugged Willys Overland Jeeps. Its founder, Gabriel Fernandez Sayago, was a visionary who believed in Mexico's industrial potential. For years, they built a reputation for quality and durability, assembling Jeeps that were perfect for the country's demanding terrain. They understood the market. They understood the land. But assembly was not enough. The 1962 decree was the catalyst. In 1963, the company was reorganized. The Mexican government, through its development bank SOMEX, became a majority shareholder. A new name was chosen, a name that was a statement of purpose. Vehículos Automotores Mexicanos, VAM. While the Big Three saw the 60% local content rule as a problem to be managed, VAM saw it as a mandate to innovate. Their technology partner was the American Motors Corporation, or AMC. AMC was the eternal underdog in the American market, the David to the Big Three's Goliath. This shared identity created a unique partnership. AMC was more flexible, more willing to allow its Mexican counterpart the freedom to experiment. This was the key. VAM was not just a licensee, it became an incubator. The first challenge was the most fundamental: the engine. AMC provided its excellent lineup of engines, particularly its robust inline six-cylinder designs. But the problem remained. An engine designed in Kenosha, Wisconsin, for sea-level operation, would lose up to 22% of its horsepower in Mexico City. It was a simple matter of physics. Less air density means less oxygen for combustion. Less oxygen means less power. The Big Three's solution was simple: do nothing. Mexican customers would just have to live with sluggish performance. The engineers at VAM refused to accept this. This was their moment of obsession. They gathered in their small engineering department on the outskirts of Mexico City. They looked at the AMC engine blocks, the specifications, the blueprints. What if? That question is the beginning of all innovation. What if we don't just copy the American design? What if we adapt it? What if we perfect it for our conditions? It was a radical idea. It was like a local bookstore deciding to rewrite a chapter of a best-selling novel to better suit its readers. The problem was brutally complex. It wasn't just about power. It was about efficiency, durability, and cost. Mexican gasoline had a lower octane rating, which could cause engine-destroying knock or pre-detonation in high-performance engines. So the challenge was threefold: increase power at high altitude, ensure reliability with lower-quality fuel, and do it all using domestically produced components to meet the 60% rule. The engineers at VAM had a revelation, a moment of pure clarity. The solution wasn't one single change. It was a symphony of small, intelligent modifications. They started with AMC's tough 232 cubic inch inline-six engine. First, they addressed the altitude. To compensate for the thin air, they needed to force more of the air-fuel mixture into each cylinder. This meant redesigning the cylinder head. They developed a new head with higher compression. This squeezed the mixture more tightly before ignition, extracting more power from every stroke. But higher compression increased the risk of engine knock with low-octane fuel. So, they moved to the next instrument in their orchestra, the camshaft. The camshaft controls the engine's breathing, opening and closing the valves. VAM engineers designed their own unique camshaft profiles. These cams held the valves open for a slightly different duration than the American ones, optimizing airflow for their specific compression ratio and altitude. It was a subtle, brilliant piece of tuning. The result was an engine that breathed more deeply and efficiently in the thin mountain air. But they didn't stop there. They took AMC's larger 258 cubic inch engine and performed an even more audacious feat of engineering. They increased its bore, the diameter of the cylinders, while keeping the original piston stroke. This was not a simple tweak. It required new pistons, new calculations, and a complete reevaluation of the engine's dynamics. The result was a new engine that existed nowhere else in the world, a 282 cubic inch, 4.6-liter, inline-six. Let me repeat that. A small Mexican company created its own unique engine displacement, one not offered by its giant American technology partner. This new 4.6-liter engine was a masterpiece. It was equipped with their proprietary high-compression head and custom camshaft. It produced significantly more horsepower and torque than the American version it was based on. It was an engine born of necessity, designed with intelligence, and built with pride. In 1971, the first Triumph arrived. VAM launched the classic DPL, a version of the AMC Matador. On the outside, it looked familiar, but under the hood, it was entirely different. It housed the new generation of VAM-tuned engines. The public reaction was immediate. These cars were fast. A VAM Classic could leave a supposedly identical Ford or Chrysler product in its dust, especially on a high-altitude highway. The press was stunned. Competitors were baffled. VAM wasn't just assembling cars anymore. It was setting a new standard for performance in the Mexican market. The validation came not just on the streets, but on the racetrack. VAM cars, especially the sporty Javelin and the compact American Rally, began to dominate Mexican touring car championships. They were lighter, better balanced, and their high-altitude engines gave them a distinct advantage. They became heroes. Owning a VAM was a statement. It meant you valued engineering, you valued performance, and you valued a domestic product that could beat the imports at their own game. The company entered its golden age. The 1970s were VAM's decade. The engineering department, emboldened by its success, became even more daring. They didn't just modify engines, they started creating unique models. They took the AMC Hornet, a compact economy car, and turned it into a high-performance icon, the Rally AMX. They gave it the powerful 282 engine, a 4-speed manual transmission, bold graphics, and a tuned suspension. It was a muscle car in a compact package, a concept that didn't truly exist in the United States. They created the VM Lerma in 1981. This was perhaps their most audacious project. The engineers took the chassis and front end of a VAM Concorde, an AMC Concorde, and masterfully grafted on the rear hatchback design of an AMC Spirit. The result was a car that looked like nothing else on the road. A unique, stylish, and practical 5-door sedan hatchback hybrid. It was a car designed by Mexicans, for Mexicans, and built only in Mexico. VAM had achieved the dream. They had a market share of over 20%. They had a fiercely loyal customer base. They were profitable. They were a symbol of national pride, proof that Mexican ingenuity could stand on its own. Their cars were known for what they called El Sabor Mexicano, the Mexican flavor. It was an absolute triumph, a testament to a small team of passionate engineers who refused to accept the status quo. But VAM didn't know that its real battle was just beginning. A battle that had nothing to do with horsepower or engineering. A battle against forces so large, so powerful, that no amount of ingenuity could overcome them. Before continuing to the tragic final act of this story, I want to ask you something. What we see here is a company that thrived under a protectionist government policy, but was also deeply dependent on that same government's stability. Do you think VAM's reliance on a single government partner and a single foreign technology source was a fatal flaw from the start? Or was its collapse simply an unavoidable tragedy in the face of global economic forces that were beyond its control? Let me know your opinion in the comments. I read them very carefully. And if you are finding this story of forgotten history valuable, a simple click on the like button helps this channel enormously with the algorithm. It tells the system that these stories matter and should be seen by more people. Now, let's continue. To understand VAM's fall, you have to understand the people who built it. This was not just a corporation. For the engineers, designers, and factory workers, VAM was a cause. Many of the lead engineers, like the legendary Ricardo Rodriguez Palacios, were not just employees. They were patriots. They worked long hours, often with limited resources, driven by a shared passion. They would take cars home on the weekend, not for leisure, but to test a new carburetor setting or a different suspension bushing. They listened to customers. They went to races. They lived and breathed their work because they were building more than just a machine. They were building a piece of their nation's identity. This was not the cold bureaucratic culture of the Big Three. This was a family. A team united by a common purpose to prove that Hecho en Mexico, made in Mexico, was a mark of excellence. This passion is what made their cars so special, and it's what made the end so devastating. The storm clouds gathered in the late 1970s. The world was rocked by two oil crises. For Mexico, an oil-exporting nation, this initially seemed like a blessing. Oil prices soared, and money poured into the national treasury. The government went on a massive spending spree, borrowing heavily against future oil revenues. The economy overheated, inflation began to spiral out of control. Then, the turn. In the early 1980s, the global price of oil collapsed. Suddenly, Mexico's primary source of income was slashed, but the mountains of debt it had acquired remained. The country was heading for a cliff. In February 1982, the external blow landed. The Mexican government was forced into a massive devaluation of the peso. Overnight, the currency lost a huge percentage of its value against the dollar. For VAM, this was a catastrophe. While they had achieved 60% local content, they still relied on their partner, AMC, for key components, technology licenses, and design elements. And they had to pay for these in dollars. Suddenly, their costs skyrocketed. The price of their cars had to go up, just as the purchasing power of their customers was collapsing. The market for new cars evaporated almost overnight. VAM was trapped. But there was another blow to come. Across the border, their partner AMC was also in deep financial trouble. In 1980, the French automaker Renault had acquired a controlling stake in AMC. Renault had its own plans. They had their own cars, their own engines, their own global strategy. They had little interest in the unique, quirky, and now expensive VAM-AMC hybrids being built in Mexico City. They saw VAM not as a partner, but as an asset to be liquidated. The final act came with a change in political leadership. In late 1982, a new administration came to power in Mexico under President Miguel de la Madrid. Facing a full-blown national debt crisis, their new economic policy was one of austerity and liberalization. The old model of state-owned protected industries was to be dismantled. The government, VAM's majority owner and protector, needed cash. It began selling off state enterprises. VAM was on the auction block. Renault, already the owner of AMC, was the logical buyer. In 1983, they purchased the Mexican government's shares in VAM. The end was swift and brutal. Renault's executives had no sentimental attachment to the VAM legacy. They saw a factory, not a dream. Their goal was to produce Renault cars in Mexico for the North American market. The VAM-specific models, the unique engines, the entire culture of Mexican-led innovation, it was all irrelevant to their plans. In October 1983, the order was given. Production of all VAM-branded vehicles was to cease. The last VAM Rally AMX, the last Lerma, the last of the cars with the legendary 4.6-liter engine, rolled off the assembly line. The factory was retooled. The engineers who had poured their lives into creating a uniquely Mexican car were reassigned or let go. The dream was over. The story of VAM is a tragedy, but it is not a story of failure. They did not fail technologically. In fact, they succeeded brilliantly. They proved that a developing nation could create a product that was not just equal, but in some ways superior to those of the global superpowers. They did not fail commercially due to a bad product. They built cars that people loved, cars that won races and captured the public imagination. VAM's demise was the result of a perfect storm of external forces: a national debt crisis, a currency collapse, a change in government policy, a corporate takeover by a foreign entity with different priorities. VAM demonstrated that the greatest barrier to innovation is often not the lack of talent or resources, but the lack of imagination and the fragility of the economic and political systems we build. Today, when you see a VAM on the streets of Mexico City, it's more than just a classic car. It is a ghost. It is a beautiful, powerful reminder of a road not taken. A glimpse of an alternate history where Mexican industry continued to forge its own path. Why does this story matter, decades after the last car rolled off the line? Because in a world still dominated by a few tech giants and monolithic corporations, the story of VAM is a powerful lesson. It teaches us that ingenuity is universal. It can blossom in a small engineering department in Mexico City just as easily as it can in Detroit or Silicon Valley. Every time someone doubts that a small company can challenge a large one, that a local team can improve upon a global design, the legacy of VAM is there to prove them wrong. The engineers at VAM gave their country more than just cars. They gave it a brief shining moment where it saw its own potential realized, a moment of pride, of performance, of world-class engineering that was uniquely its own. That is a legacy that can never be dismantled. Vehículos Automotores Mexicanos, 1963 to 1983. A dream of steel, engineering, and national pride, parked but never forgotten.